Of all the David Bowie clips, I think for Australians especially, this is one that's blazed into the national consciousness because, of course, it was filmed in this country.
Yes, absolutely. And David Bowie is in it throughout, but the main characters are played by two Aboriginal performers, Terry Roberts and Jolene King. Daniel, I understand that you've got a pretty personal connection to this video. Can you start by telling us when you first saw it and what your reaction was?
Yeah, I was 10. I was a black fellow growing up in Tweed Heads in northern New South Wales. First kind of positive or neutral images of Aboriginal people I'd seen outside of the news media. And for me, it was pivotal because I was coming into consciousness. I was just 10. And seeing faces that I could recognise and people that I could recognise that were like me, it had a huge effect.
How much do we know about the backstory of how the video clip actually came about?
Well, Bowie actually did own a flat here in Elizabeth Bay in Sydney, and he held onto it until the 1990s. And he was a huge fan of this country, but he also saw the other side. And I think when he was filming Let's Dance, and he also filmed China Girl, incidentally, at the same time. China Girl's also from the same album, set on Sydney Harbour as well. I'd be interested to hear some critique of that particular film clip. But this one came about because he was here, and he gave an interview with Rolling Stone and spoke quite voluminously about Australian racism. And he wanted to challenge that, and that's why the first scene is that outback pub at Corinda. And you can kind of feel the claustrophobia. You know, there's a lot of the angle of the camera is they're shot from the ground. The Aboriginal actors, the two dancers, wearing this Australia T-shirt. It's dripping with sarcasm and irony. But you know, Bowie's up against the wall of this pub playing an electric guitar that's not plugged in with white gloves. So I think he was kind of aware of the artifice of the music video.
I'm just curious, Daniel, you know, it's drawing on Australian history, racism, but it's also inspired by this quite dark fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen about a pair of essentially cursed red shoes. Why do you think he chose those red shoes?
I think because it's a European dreaming story, in the sense that, you know, the idea of the philosophical death dance. You know, you put on these shoes, you can't take them off. And in the fairy tale, this young woman who, through vanity, puts on these red silk shoes, when she's told not to by her grandmother, she is unable to take them off. She can't stop dancing. In the end of the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, the legs have to be amputated in order to get these shoes off. In the film clip in Let's Dance, Bowie's using the red shoes. They're a bit like the Coke can that's dropped in Gods Must Be Crazy, you know, this kind of object of this weird, magical, mysterious object. But in this film clip, they're actually they're an icon of, you know, Western materialism and capitalism, late stage capitalism. But I come back to the three things that he decided to put. There's an image of a pink sky which illuminates the Warrumbungle Range out in Western New South Wales. Very important 4 seconds for me. It's alluding to the British nuclear tests. It hadn't been a Royal Commission yet. It was about to happen. You know, this despoiling of Aboriginal land. You know, he saw that. Then also this kind of idea of economic disempowerment. You know, the male actor is kind of hauling this steel milling machine up Broadway, just not, a few metres from where I'm standing right now. And then the female lead actor is actually scrubbing the same stretch of highway. So he's talking about, you know, stolen generations, by implication, economic disempowerment, domestic slavery, and the British nuclear tests in 4 minutes.
It's so interesting that around this era as well, David Bowie wasn't necessarily the only prominent British musician who was dealing with black-white racism and tension in Australia. Before Let's Dance actually came out, Kate Bush released The Dreaming, both the album and the single, which in its own way deals with white-black relations here in Australia. What was your take on that song?
This song and album, The Dreaming, is an interesting one. I mean, she fakes an Australian accent. She talks about, like, kangaroos hitting the bonnets of cars. Mistaken for a tree, till you near him on the motorway, the tree begin to breathe. If you go deeper, she's not as disrespectful as you might think. But in the video, certainly, you're on this kind of lunar outback landscape, and there's all these white fellows dressed up in, I guess, body stockings and body paint, making themselves out to look like blackfellas in the bush. But yeah, at a deeper level, I think she was a little bit more aware. But yeah, the video that Bush created is completely wrong.
Quite a contrast to David Bowie's Let's Dance. Speaking of which, Jolene King, one of the Aboriginal performers in that clip, told the Sydney Morning Herald in 2014 that the Let's Dance clip showed the rest of the world that there are Indigenous people here in Australia and that we're not this textbook carbon copy of someone standing there with a spear, that there are modern Aboriginals. How far have we come in terms of global pop culture representation of First Nations Australians since then?
I'm not sure that we've come very far, but I do regard this as a kind of a watershed in terms of that representation, because globally, I don't know how many representations there'd been of Aboriginality in global pop culture. I mean, he was the biggest star of his time, and he chose, instead of lolling around on a beach like he does in China Girl, he chooses not to be the star of this film clip. He puts two Aboriginal people and their mob at the centre of the story. And then there's this beautiful moment for me where it's a real paradigm shift, and many people would miss it. But for the longest time during this film clip, the camera is an eye. It's tracing their movements. It's watching them, ethnographically almost, anthropologically even. And then this moment when they're kind of perched, actually in the giraffe enclosure at Taronga Zoo, if you must know the truth, on a fake embankment. The two lead actors are looking into the harbour over Shark Island. The camera moves behind them so that you are part of their mob. You see what they see. And for me, that's a real paradigm shift from being the object of the gaze to actually being more of a subject and kind of driving narratives.